Good evening. My name is Avinoam Patt. I'm the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. And it's a real pleasure for us to welcome you here this evening for the lecture by Professor Amy Weiss on passports for Palestine, forged travel documents, and American volunteers in Israel's War of Independence. Before I turn the screen over and introduce Amy as our speaker this evening, I just want to mention a few upcoming programs that we have next week at the Center for Judaic Studies at UConn. Next Thursday night, November 10th, we'll have our annual Kristallnacht lecture, which will feature a lecture by Daniel Green, whose work is featured in the new Ken Burns documentary on the US and the Holocaust. Danny Green was the curator of Americans in the Holocaust, the exhibit at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, upon which the documentary is based. So I'd encourage all of you to join us next Thursday evening. It's at 7:30 p.m. Sierra has dropped the Zoom link into the chat at the bottom if you want to register for the program. So we're really excited to welcome Professor Amy Weiss to deliver the lecture this evening. And as many of you know, Amy is the director of the Greenberg Center, and it's been a real pleasure for us to have continue many wonderful collaborations between the Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford, where I served as the Feltman Professor of Modern Jewish History for 12 years from 2007 to 2019, and then was fortunate enough to serve on the committee that decided to bring Amy Weiss to the University of Hartford to be the next director of the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies. And I have to say, I think we made a wonderful decision. I'm very excited that we have Amy here as a member of our community. In fact, so excited to have Amy as a member of our community that this semester, when I'm on a teaching leave, teaching at the New York University, I invited Amy to join us at UConn as an adjunct professor to teach a class on Israel history and society, which is a course that she is teaching for us this semester that I normally teach at UConn. So a few words on Amy, and then I'll turn the screen over to her. Amy joined the Greenberg Center in January of 2021 after completing a Thomas and Alyssa Katz Fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania's Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, where she began working on a book on American Jewish evangelical relations. Amy completed her PhD work at New York University in Judaic Studies, and her research and publications focus on the intersections of American Jewish history, Israel studies, and Jewish-Christian relations, including a current book manuscript on American Jewish evangelical interfaith relations in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Most recently, Amy's articles have been published in the journals American Jewish History, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and Israel Studies, and in the edited volumes Teaching the Arab-Israeli Conflict and Minhagim, Custom and Practice in Jewish Life. And as mentioned, in the fall semester of 2021, she is also teaching Israel History and Society at the University of Connecticut. And I have to say, we've been getting rave reviews about her teaching. Students have really enjoyed learning from you this semester, Amy. So it's a pleasure for us to have you here this evening as our visiting lecturer speaking on passports for Palestine, forged travel documents, and American volunteers in Israel's War of Independence. I will turn the screen over to you. Thank you, Amy. Oh, one other note, my apologies. You'll notice that you have been muted as you've entered the program. This is to minimize disruptions. However, we would encourage you to submit any questions that you have for Amy during her lecture or after her lecture through the chat feature, and then we'll be able to have a robust Q&A, and we'll know who's asking the questions after Amy completes her lecture. So without further ado, I'm happy to turn the screen over to Professor Amy Weiss.
Thank you. So hopefully I just shared my screen. Hopefully everyone can see it. And I have to thank Avi for that lovely introduction. It's been wonderful, especially coming to the University of Hartford in the midst of the pandemic. It's been great to have Avi as as a great support system, colleague, and friend. So I want to thank Avi for all of his help and continued help in getting to know, right? It's once you're involved and embedded in a university, you might be able to leave the university, but part of it stays with you. So I really valued Avi's knowledge and kind of knowing about the inner workings of the Greenberg Center. So I really appreciate that. And it's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces and names. So thank you for joining. And I'm really looking forward to talking a little bit about my research. So I've done research on Americans who volunteered in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, specifically for the Israel Defense Forces. And tonight I thought I would talk a little bit about this really, what I consider to be this interesting aspect of the legal and illegal aspects of this war. So essentially, first of all, what was prompting Americans to fight in a foreign war? And we won't know how many people decided not to fight. We'll talk about who decided to fight and why. But we know that the American government and the laws they put on foreign fighters definitely dissuaded individuals, but we're going to talk about the individuals who decided to travel to Palestine and later Israel, and some of the consequences that they experienced or believe they would experience during this time. Okay, so here, and again, so just to highlight, so I have this image, and pay attention to this figure. If you can see my mouse all the way on the left, Ralph Lowenstein. He's an 18-year-old from Virginia and also a student at Columbia University. He's a freshman there, one of the youngest volunteers from the United States. And we're going to talk about him a little bit later. So we'll come back to him. But essentially, who are these volunteers? We're talking about approximately 1,100 Americans, overwhelmingly men. 90 to 95% of them are Jews who decided to travel to Palestine and later Israel to fight for the IDF. So this is a relatively, right, in terms of the American Jewish community, we're talking about a sliver of this American Jewish community. And later on, I'll talk about this idea of what people do talk about in 1948 and after, and what they don't talk about their service and why, and how we can get some information about the burgeoning US-Israel relationship from what people say and don't say about their service. Okay, so often you'll hear me talking about either Machal or machalnikim. So Machal is a Hebrew acronym for Mitnadei Chutz La'aretz, or volunteers from abroad. So in 1948, the IDF, right, it used to be the Haganah. It is formed, all of the Haganah and other fighting units are combined or dissolved rather, and the IDF is created. So in 1948, it's decided that there are so many volunteers coming to fight for a Jewish state that a separate unit is needed to manage these overseas volunteers. So this is where we get Machal from. There's an entire unit, but you have many of these Americans as well as individuals from South Africa, from Britain, from Canada, from you name it, many of them, even if it's just a handful, they're coming to Israel. And why are they coming? Well, there's a variety of reasons. They're coming, they were soldiers in World War II, and they see themselves as career soldiers. They're looking for the next war. So much so that there are even reports in 1949 in Israel that there are Indonesian recruits coming to bring soldiers from the war back to Indonesia to fight there. So we have this focus on soldiers with experience. We also have this concern among Jews. Either they had relatives, family members who died in the Holocaust. They see the establishment of the Jewish state as something that they want to personally be involved with. Then we also have individuals who were looking for adventure, who were looking to go abroad. And so we'll focus on this travel aspect. How did these individuals get to Israel? How did they return? And so we'll do that by looking at specifically one individual. And then if we have time, we'll go back and talk about, again, Ralph Lowenstein, and perhaps you're familiar with Mickey Marcus. So we'll also talk about the illegal and legal aspects there of these individual volunteers. Okay, so Larry Hoffman, in 1948, he is an American Jewish undergraduate. He's studying at City College in Manhattan. He applies for a passport to go to France. But there's some question about, is he really going to France? He's called in to the passport office to explain his intentions. And here, this is from his affidavit in June 1948. So he's explaining his intentions. So he says, in furtherance of my career, I applied for a passport about March 1948, in which I stated I intended to go to France. I contemplated representing the firm of LD Borgen and Company at Paris, France, but the deal fell through. In the meantime, I had made some contacts with a neighbor, Mrs. Eva Warshawski. She gave me a letter of introduction to Mr. I. Wingrad of 14 Leventon Street in Tel Aviv, Palestine, who is in the export business of general merchandise. And now here, this is my emphasis. He says, I had no experience in filling out passports and was under the impression that any country I would put down would suffice for me to receive a passport. And for this reason, I did not change the location after I had decided to go to Tel Aviv, Palestine. And here you'll notice the reference to Palestine. So before May 1948, the historical reference to the land of Israel is Palestine. And then after May 1948, when Israel is established, there's reference to Israel. So just in case if there's a question about terminology, that's the reason. Okay, so this is a reason Larry Hoffman gives for why the passport officials figure out that actually they think he's going to Israel. And especially because there's a 1940 Nationality Act that says that Americans cannot serve in a foreign war unless they receive express permission from the government, right? So this is in the wake of World War II. This, and again, in 1948, the Cold War is very much boiling over. And the American government is concerned about questions of dual loyalties, of enemies to the state. So this concern about individuals going to a foreign country, especially to fight in a war, that's of concern. But yet you have this really interesting aspect that at the same time that you have officials stopping Larry Hoffman to say, are you really going to Palestine? And if you are, what are you really trying to do there? Is it really for business? At the same time, you have American officials flying to Israel in late 48 and 1949, saying, we understand that Americans have come to Israel with fake passports. We're willing to give them the proper documents so they can enter the US legally, right? So again, everything that I'll be talking about today, there'll be two sides to it. Is it illegal? And if it is, are American officials looking the other way? Is it legal? Are people still following these laws? Okay, so here, let's look at the two sides to Larry Hoffman's trip to Israel. So we have two accounts, and we'll start with the State Department account on the right. So in fall 1948, the State Department declares that Hoffman actually arrives in Israel, right? He said he wanted to go to Paris, France, and then he decides he wants to go to Israel for business, and he doesn't update his passport application. So the State Department says, looking back, in 1949, it's determined that Hoffman entered Israel with Panamanian papers, and his passport was taken. So this is one of the reasons why he's using Panamanian papers. Then on his way back to the United States, he goes by way of Canada using a British passport under the name of Montague Ritterband. And then the plan was for him to use his American birth certificate when he would cross over from Canada to the United States. But this plan is, again, right, this is the State Department account. The plan is, there's a problem with the plan because Hoffman is caught in Canada. And while he's waiting in Canada to have his identity confirmed by American officials, he is asked to fill out an affidavit. Again, right? Why were you in Israel? Why are you using a fake passport? And then we're also told that in August 1949, the State Department writes a letter to Hoffman, and this is revoking his passport privileges, saying, in the event that you should have occasion to proceed abroad, it is suggested that you so inform the department, which will then give consideration to the return of your passport to you. So essentially, the State Department says, Larry Hoffman, we are on to you. And for the time being, you cannot leave the United States. If you choose to do so in the future, you're going to have to apply. And the archival records show in the 1950s, Hoffman in fact did apply to leave the US. Okay, but now we have Hoffman's accounts. So in June 1948, when he is giving his initial affidavit of why did you not write Israel, but you instead you wrote France as to where you're going, he says, I solemnly swear I have no intention of joining the armed forces of any of the countries in Europe and the Near East, particularly the state of Israel. I also swear I am not a member, nor have I ever been a member of any Zionist organization. And then we have at the same time in March 1949, where the State Department is verifying Hoffman's identity, and it's found out that he has entered Canada illegally. Hoffman says, again, I have no involvement in the IDF. I might have been traveling abroad. I might have been using false papers. And he doesn't necessarily say all of this in terms of confessing to the false paperwork, but he does say, I was asked to join the Haganah, but I told this individual I was not interested in the army as I did not want to lose my citizenship. So here, of course, the question is, who can we believe what's true? And in some ways, it doesn't matter because we can see from these statements that there's a real concern about the legality of traveling to Israel to serve in the Israel Defense Forces. And there's also a concern about the consequences of being caught using false documents, right? So Hoffman, as a way to counteract any problems that he may face, he's actively saying, I have no intention of serving in the IDF. I don't belong to any Zionist organizations, and I definitely don't want to lose my citizenship, right? I see myself as an American and not belonging to any other country. So here again, this question of who do we believe? Just some more evidence about Larry Hoffman. And here from the perspective of Machal, right? Mitnavei chutz la'aretz, volunteers from abroad. So despite Hoffman's statements to the contrary, that he did not serve in the IDF, we actually have a lot of evidence that he did. For instance, he served as president of the American Veterans of Israel organization. They're presumably to be not only a member, but a president of American Veterans of Israel. You need to be a veteran of one of Israel's wars. So, right, obviously this is after the fact, after 1948. Hoffman also completes a questionnaire about his service and volunteerism in the 1948 war. So, and we'll look at those answers to this questionnaire in a few minutes to see what Hoffman has to say, again, confirming that he did indeed serve. And not only that, another piece of evidence about Hoffman is he's included in the World Machal database. So if you are interested in who served, what country were they from, what division of the Israeli military did they serve in, you can Google the World Machal database, and then you can Google, or excuse me, you can put in the name of any individual, or you can just look at the list of individuals. So you don't necessarily need to be searching for someone. And when you type in Larry Hoffman, indeed, Larry Hoffman from the United States Army 72nd Battalion Infantry comes up. So why do I have all of this information? Again, to highlight this idea of the lengths that Hoffman went to. And again, I'm not using Hoffman to single him out, but to use him as an example that this was very common for Americans who wanted to fight in the 1948 war to use a fake name or to use fake passports or any fake documentation to get in and to get out of Israel. So here, Hoffman's doing a lot of work trying to backtrack, trying to protect any information as a way of protecting himself from the consequences. So we know, right, that Hoffman's passport is eventually taken away. In the 1950s, he has to reapply for a passport. But this is, for the most part, this is some of the most extreme measures that is American Machal members faced. We do have the example, for instance, of Al Schwimmer, who was very much involved in the shipment of war material as well as planes to Israel. He is fined. He is convicted of violating the Nationality Act, and his civil rights are taken away. So in terms of he's not able to vote for many years. It's not until the Clinton administration that these rights are restored. And we also have the case of Charlie Winters, the only American volunteer from 1948 who was actually convicted and serves time. So he's an Irish Protestant from Boston, and he serves 18 months. And it's not until the Bush administration where he is posthumously absolved of these supposed crimes these convicted crimes. So again, just to highlight, we only have one person of all of the hundreds of people who used false passports, false documents. So really the threat was there, but again, it's this interesting duality of what actually happens. And for the most part, the threat is only a threat. Okay, so just to give another example of the use of false names and false information to get into Israel. So perhaps David Mickey Marcus is the most famous American volunteer who served in the 1948 war. So just a little bit of information about David Mickey Marcus. So he is a leading soldier in World War II. David Ben-Gurion comes to him in 1947 saying, we need to overhaul what becomes the IDF. Can you please interview people and find me a good candidate for this job? After several individuals either turn down the job or after it's decided that they're not a good fit, David Marcus says, I will accept this position. David Marcus goes to Israel and he is killed by friendly fire. And here, I want you to take a look at, this is the front page of the June 10th, 1948 issue of Haganah Speaks. So this is a bi-weekly newspaper published by Americans for Haganah. And right, the Haganah is the forerunner to the Israel Defense Forces. So we're told that Colonel David Marcus, Supreme Commander of the Jewish Front in Jerusalem, died in action on the night of June 10th. It is one of the deepest tragedies of the present struggle that the man whose genius contributed so much to Israel's successes on the battlefield should fall in the last hours before the ceasefire. So what I want you to note here is the manner in which we're told that David Mickey Marcus died. We're told that he died in action. In actuality, that's not really the case. He was killed by friendly fire. The going story is that at night, an individual was on guard duty. David Mickey Marcus was walking around. The person on guard duty in Hebrew said, stop, identify yourself. Marcus did not speak any Hebrew, so therefore he wasn't able to communicate that, in fact, he is an American volunteer. He is in Israel working with the IDF, and because he couldn't identify himself, the individual on guard duty fired and Marcus is killed. But this idea of died in action, right, again, this is a newspaper for Americans, presumably the large majority of its readership, American Jews who are supportive of the Haganah and the IDF and are supportive of Israel's role in creating a Jewish state. They are attributing this idea that, right, that David Mickey Marcus died fighting for Israel. And I also highlight this because, again, we have this duality of what can people say about fighting and what can people not say. And there was a concern, again, that if it was found out that family members were actually not, for instance, going to France on a business trip, but were actually going to Israel to serve in the IDF, what would happen to them? Would the American government punish them for these actions? Again, technically illegal to serve in a foreign military. So here, right, again, so this is public knowledge. This is being published in Haganah Speaks. Again, the readership is relatively small, but yet they're not holding back that David Marcus is in Israel. So again, this duality of what can you say, what can you not say, what's true, and how is this, how is the idea either enlarged or diminished to serve a specific purpose? And just to highlight how David Marcus has been remembered, so on the left-hand side, a poster for Cast a Giant Shadow, the 1966 movie with Kirk Douglas, and even just the words that we have: outnumbered, unarmed, unprepared. They stunned the world with their incredible victory. Right, again, painting a very specific David versus Goliath image of Israel during the 1948 war. And then if we look at the gravestone of David Marcus, he's a West Point graduate. He's buried in West Point. And here we have his birth date and his death date, but there's no mention on the gravestone itself of how he died. We just know he died on June 10th, 1948 in Jerusalem. And we're also told he's a soldier for all humanity. Perhaps this idea that he fought for the US, he fought for Israel without that specific mention saying that he is an individual fighting for everyone. But it's not until decades later that the plaque at the bottom of this gravestone is added. And the text is small, so I apologize, but I can tell you what it says. It says, in recognition of his sacrifice for the establishment of the state of Israel. So here, and again, there's a reason why this is added decades later. This concern that this is the only individual buried in West Point who was fighting in a foreign war. So there's the concern of what might that look like? What does that mean? And also this idea of how might this affect Marcus's family, right? Again, this illegality, legality. And Marcus is perhaps the best example of, it is well known by the US military and the US government that he is fighting in Israel. So again, there are all of these what if questions. What if this happens? Or different measures of, is it legal? Can you get around it? Maybe no one will say anything. Do we want to find out? Right, so David Mickey Marcus is a unique case in that way, but I think this addition of the plaque decades later also highlights that once Americans in general and American Jews more specifically become more comfortable with questions of not more comfortable with questions of dual loyalty, but those questions very much go away, that this is something where it's seen as it's okay to blatantly state that, yes, Mickey Marcus served in the 1948 war on behalf of Israel. Now, I think we have time for one more example of questions about who served, how did they serve, essentially, how did they get to Israel, and how did they return? Oh, actually, this reminds me, before we do that, I just wanted to show you. This is Larry Hoffman's questionnaire from the 1990s, right? So I mentioned Larry Hoffman was talking about, no, I did not serve in the IDF. Well, here he's talking about how he served. And so this questionnaire was created by Ralph Lowenstein, the individual in the first photo that I showed you. And we'll talk about Lowenstein in a second. So here on the first page, we can see that Larry Hoffman includes his location. He was born in New York City. His parents were either from Poland or New York. And then there are several questions. Tell us about your life before World War II. Tell us about your life before 1948. Tell us about your life after. And then on this last page, right, we have Larry Hoffman's signature, signed in 1992. For instance, one of the questions, was your life changed significantly by your service with Israel? Hoffman checks the box yes and says, I am a better Jew and I help wherever I am called upon to. What do you think your personal service and that of other volunteers contributed to Israel's war effort? Whatever we did, we contributed and showed the Israelis how to fight, right? So very definitive statements about Hoffman's participation in the 1948 war. Now, I want to shift to talking about Larry Hoffman to talking about Ralph Lowenstein, the creator of these documents, these questionnaires. So here we have, this is an image of Ralph Lowenstein later in his life, but just as a reminder, look, let me skip ahead. We have, this is a photo of Ralph Lowenstein when he was 18. So, and again, I'll just, right, as a reminder, we saw his photo when he was 18. Okay, so some information about Ralph Lowenstein. So again, from Virginia, a student at Columbia University, he's 18. He feels compelled as an American Jew that fighting in Israel is something that he has to do. And he has this incredible statement that in 1948, it felt like it was 1776. So he makes this comparison with the founding of the US and the founding of Israel, saying, I wasn't there in 1776, but I want to be there in 1948, and highlighting the connection between the US and Israel. And he also wrote about how he's 18, he has no military experience, but he said, I did know how to drive. The IDF needed drivers, so therefore I became a half-track driver. He goes to Israel via Marseille. He is stationed at a DP camp. He uses the identity papers of a displaced person after World War II, and that's how he gets into Israel. On the way out, though, we have this really telling statement from him. He's requesting formal discharge papers, right? He wants the evidence with his real name on it that he fought for the IDF. So he says, I would treasure it and it would mean a lot to me. So again, using false documents, but yet he wants to have record of his service. And I should note that his parents actually write to the IDF saying, we want Ralph to be back in school by the start of September, so you better do everything you can, because he never signed any official paperwork saying that he would be there for a certain length of time. And what I found really fascinating with Ralph, so Ralph died in 2020. Before he died, I was able to interview him. And from all accounts that I've heard and from my own experience, the most generous of individuals. And he felt really strongly about and recognizing the duality that existed between the illegality of serving in the 1948 war and also the later on, especially this interest in American volunteerism in Israel. So Lowenstein, as a professor and dean of journalism and communications at the University of Florida, creates a museum. And not only does he create a museum about the machalnikim, the volunteers, but he specifically creates the questionnaires, right? So these are multi-page documents, and he wants to know essentially, how did serving in the war benefit you? Did it impact your children? So he is trying to capture all of this information that he believes was never captured because Americans were concerned, especially those who were serving in the IDF, they were concerned that if this information got out, something bad could happen to them or their family. And we know overall, those were just threats or concerns. Most people did not have anything negative happen to them, but that threat was enough for them to conceal this information. And to further highlight how far American Jewish history and American history in general has come with the discussion of American machalnikim, we have in 2011, and this is also the same time when the Center for Jewish History is acquiring the archives and museum that Ralph Lowenstein started at the University of Florida. Lowenstein is given an award at the Center for Jewish History, the Emma Lazarus Statue of Liberty Award. This is considered to be one of the premier awards highlighting the efforts of American Jews. And here we can see that Al Schwimmer, who was convicted of smuggling weapons and planes to Israel, he's also given an award. So again, I argue this is something that wouldn't have happened earlier in the span of American Jewish history, but it's only when the Cold War is coming to an end, it's only when the relationship between the US and Israel has been strengthened that it is something where American Jews are interested and actively looking to recapture this information about this, what they consider a lost time period. And again, right, so here's an image of Ralph Lowenstein beside a half track. And Lowenstein, right, had no military experience. He actually goes on to fight in the Korean War. And so this is some more info, we'll skip this, but some more info about the awarding of this award and the archive that Ralph Lowenstein started. Okay, and again, to further highlight this question about how far American Jewish history and American history has come, these are just in the past decade and a half, some of the ways that American volunteers in the 1948 war have been recognized. So right, starting with the American Jewish Historical Society acquiring this archive, really putting in not only the effort to maintain the archive, but the money as well to make sure that researchers decades going forward can benefit. And again, I have to say thank you publicly to the American Jewish Historical Society. If it wasn't for both Ralph Lowenstein's creation of this material and the Center for Jewish History's acquisition of this material, much of my own research would not be possible. And this is not to say that, right, if you go to archives in Israel, you can find a lot of information about volunteers, but it's specifically the experiences of American volunteers in the 1948 war that is harder to find. Okay, so the AJHS at the Center for Jewish History also has an exhibit about using the material. And then in a museum in Tel Aviv, a year later, has another exhibit. In 2014, 2015, you have documentaries. And then also every year up until 2022, you have individual surviving volunteers who go to Mickey Marcus's grave every June, and there is a memorial. And of course, much of this is happening when either the number of survivors is diminishing or they're very getting on in age. So here, by way of conclusion, to think about, again, some of these themes that were highlighted. that there's this need to remember and not forget. And I think Ralph Lowenstein really highlights that need, right? This desire to create an archive, to contact hundreds of volunteers from the war. He gets about 500 questionnaires, but not only that, photos, stories, people write. There are books that have been written. People submit manuscripts to him. So really this rich history of what it was like to serve in the 1948 war. And this quote, I think, is really meaningful. We're told we are fighting a losing battle with time. Every week brings news of the passing of another of our comrades, a loss sad enough in itself, but with each of us goes the memories, the information, and the irretrievable record of what happened in those years and our part in it. Now, of course, these irretrievable records, in part, there's a reason why these might be irretrievable or incomplete. That's how Ralph Lowenstein referred to these records. They're incomplete. And I argue part of that has to do with the question about false paperwork, false documents of getting Americans to Palestine, later Israel, and then how they left Israel. So to further highlight, many American volunteers use false documents, but at the same time, they did seek afterwards a record to document their efforts in the 1948 war. So it's this question of, as time passes and as the concern of fighting in a foreign war dissipates, they're more likely, and this is not to suggest that no one talked about it, right? We have the case of Mickey Marcus. His death is on the front page of Haganah Speaks. There's a procession. The funeral or the ceremony takes place in Brooklyn. Then the burial takes place at West Point. There's a whole committee put together to have state and city officials speak. And so it's very clear from the case of Mickey Marcus that people knew about his fighting. So again, it's to what extent did people know and did they talk about it? But they did talk about it. And so here, this question of as both the fighting over time, right? It's farther away in history. People are more comfortable. And I would argue that these questions and this familiarity with Americans or volunteers in general fighting in the 1948 war has paved the path for the lone soldiers that we see today. So again, volunteers from various countries going to Israel to fight in the contemporary IDF. So with that, I think I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. We'll do a round of applause from the audience. Thank you so much. So it's a really, really interesting topic, as you suggested, but also one that is difficult to write the history of because it's one of these topics that sort of takes place in secret. So it also makes it kind of fascinating to try to write the history of that. I have a number of questions for you to follow up, but I also want to remind folks in the audience that if they have questions, they can type them into the chat. I see we already have one that came into the chat, or indicate we're a small group. So if people want to use the hand raise function, they can also raise their hand and we'll unmute you so you can ask a question. So I'm going to ask the first question, then I'll take the question that came from the chat. I'm very curious, just sort of big picture for us. I think you indicated that there's about 1,100 volunteers who joined through Machal and fight in the war. Can you give us a sense for sort of how that fits into the number of soldiers who are fighting in the war in 1948, the number of soldiers who are in the IDF, and maybe more, kind of, I don't know if you have percentage, but like sort of how that fits into the bigger picture of the role that they play in the overall war effort. You mentioned Mickey Marcus, right, sort of as drafted by Ben-Gurion to kind of help organize the IDF, but more generally, sort of what kind of jobs, what kind of expertise do they bring? And one final part to that, like this language issue, have you come up with other cases where, when they're talking about their service, how much that becomes a problem, in terms of communicating with their fellow soldiers. So I'll stop myself there and let you respond.
Okay, well, so many questions, great questions. Let me know if I don't recall all of them. But so I think that's helpful for context. So again, these 1,100 American volunteers out of 3,500 to 4,500 volunteers overall from various countries, not those who are already in Israel. We're talking about a very small percentage of those who are fighting for the IDF. So, but I will say the reason why this range of 3,500 to 4,500, why, right? It seems that's kind of a large range when it's such a small number. And that has to do with a couple of things. When did these individuals go to Palestine and later Israel? Some scholars will only look at those who were in Israel May 14th, 1948 to 1949. So individuals who were part of Aliyah Bet. Some individuals don't consider them as part of Machal. For my purposes, I'm trying to cast a wide net to see who were these individuals who are assisting from the United States, helping to establish Israel and to fight in its war. So I look at a broad picture. And also the question of what roles are they serving? Many of these individuals are support staff. They are not necessarily doing the fighting itself. So in some cases, they are not included in this number. I like to include those individuals within the umbrella of Machal because I think it gives us a bigger picture of who these Americans are and what they're doing, right? We have the case of Tzipora Porath. She is already in Israel. She is studying at the Hebrew University when war breaks out. And her letters home have been published in a book. And her information, she's about the war, especially the siege of Jerusalem. She's giving us really important information about what it was like to be in Jerusalem in 1948 and the concern that many people experienced. But I will also say that just as there are support staff individuals who arrived before May 1948, you also have individuals who many people credit these American machalnikim with creating the Israeli Air Force. So Al Schwimmer, for instance, there's a great story where, again, Al Schwimmer is trying to recruit people along with Hal Livingston to take planes to Israel, and they set up a fake airline company, and they are trying to act, right, when they interview people for this flying job, it's all coded language about, would you like to fly? Are you interested in travel? Would you like to maybe go abroad? And depending upon the answers, it's determined, are they in on what we're trying to do, and are they supportive of this? So many of the Machal members who are killed are those killed in battle. For instance, there's an example of an individual who has an airfield named after him. A letter is sent to Elsie Pomerantz, his wife, saying, because of your husband's service, we're going to name an Israeli airfield after him. So there is a range of individuals and they have a range of roles. And I think this is also something that within Israeli history, if you look at the historical accounts of the 1948 war and you look for the term Machal, you will maybe see it on 4 pages. And that's not to suggest that they didn't play a role. In fact, they did. And but it's also is right, especially when it comes to the Air Force. The expertise that Americans from World War II had was undeniable, and the Israeli Air Force really benefited from that. But at the same time, just like you have Americans trying to curate a specific image, Israelis are also trying to curate this particular image of Israel's independence. And to suggest that they did that with help from other countries, that's not necessarily the narrative that they want, right? They want are the Israelis who were here, they're the ones who fought. And again, I'm generalizing, but I think it's important to note that there's some narrative spinning on both sides. And the ultimate answer to what happens is that Machal is often left out of these narratives.
Great. Yeah, no, it's really fascinating to sort of explore also from the perspective of how history is written, and what gets left out and the reasons that things are left out. Gary Starr, thank you, Gary, for your question, asks, you indicated that only one person served prison time in the United States for fighting for Israel. That person was not Jewish. Is there a reason why he was prosecuted while the Jewish fighters were not? And I'll add a follow-up question from Gary. Is there any evidence that any of those who fought for Israel were blacklisted after they returned?
Okay, so thanks, Gary. Good to see you. So I'll start with the second question first. So, excuse me, in the evidence that we have of Americans talking about their experience, many of them list that they had State Department files created after their experience in 1948. So having people's passports revoked, that was much more common. And again, when I say that was common, most people didn't have that experience. But in terms of the types of consequences people could experience, that might be the worst of it, where they need to reapply and then they do get their passport. But individuals definitely said that they felt that whenever they would go to an airport in the 1950s, that they thought that they were being stopped and questioned specifically because officials knew about their service. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I think it's significant that this is what they're saying. And then those that had, who said also that they had files by the State Department created, they were saying that they were labeled as, oh, I forget the exact term that many of them use, but that they were, I think something like war adventurers, and this was a concern. So I haven't necessarily found evidence that these individuals were blacklisted, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that many people felt that they were. And right, so it's a question of how much do we trust feelings? People had them, so they're real in that sense. And I think their perception of what was going on in this case is just as important as the reality. And then, so this first question, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, right? That really fascinating. Most of the individuals fighting in Machal are Jewish. 90 to 95% of them are. The ones that are not, most of them are soldiers from World War II, who this is a job for them, and also they're supportive of the establishment of a Jewish state. So here, I don't think it's an issue of religion. I think it's an issue of the offenses in terms of where they were caught, when they were caught, to the extent of what they were doing. So with Charlie Winters, of smuggling war materials and planes to Israel. But I think it's important to note that in the case of Charlie Winters, in the case of Al Schwimmer as well, that they're both pardoned by US presidents. In the case of Al Schwimmer, many people said, how come you're not requesting a pardon? How come you're not doing it yourself? And he said, I don't think I did anything wrong. If I want to be punished, or if the US wants to punish me, they can, but I'm not going to request that they, right? He didn't feel comfortable saying that, right, asking for that to be dropped. He said those, right, that's what I get, that's what I get. So the fact that both of these individuals are pardoned really highlight, so Charlie Winters pardoned by Bush, Al Schwimmer pardoned by Clinton, but there had been rumblings right? It didn't just happen during their presidencies. There had been rumblings before this. And the fact that they're both pardoned really high. So individuals who, these are the highest consequences that any American Machal received. And the fact that even though it's decades later, and in one case posthumously, it really shows how far the US has come in terms of understanding American volunteerism in Israel.
So I want to ask another question that is, and let me remind folks, if they have questions, use the hand raise function or type it into the chat. We'll be happy to take your questions for Amy. I do want to ask another question that's admittedly related very closely to work that I've done on sort of the connections between the Holocaust and the creation of the state of Israel, and some of the, the debate about those connections. And one thing that stood out to me in your presentation is that on the Mickey Marcus, on the sort of the obituary for David Mickey Marcus, it says under sort of the cause of where it says that he died and doesn't explain how he died, it says he saw Dachau on that page. And it's also, yeah, thank you. You can load the page. And it's also quite striking, right there. And I'm, we can't see it, but I'd love to read like what's under there about the he saw Dachau. And it's also quite striking that, in the Lowenstein project, right, it's sort of, there's the Machal and there's the Aliyah Bet. And the Aliyah Bet is the movement to essentially break the British blockade of Palestine for the Jewish refugees and displaced persons after the war who are trying to reach Palestine, who, from the DP camps. And you talked about the Exodus. So I'm really curious about sort of through your research and looking at the experiences of those who volunteer to fight, to what extent do they reference either what they had just seen in Europe if they were liberators, or their knowledge of what had happened to Jews during the Holocaust as a driving force for like, this is why I have to go fight. This is why, the Jewish people need their own state.
Yeah, so there's definitely this link among many of the American machalnikim. I haven't found anything, at least in the archival material that I've looked at so far. And I should say there's a host of books and published letters, and a lot of these are taking, and it's important to note when they're being published, 1970s, 1980s, right? So people are holding on to this material, and as the time passes from 1948, people are feeling more comfortable publishing it. And there's even, in one of the books, there's a foreword by Benjamin Netanyahu saying, if it weren't for American machalnikim, blah, 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 blah. And, not blah, blah, it didn't actually say that, just to be clear. But the idea was, right, if it weren't for them, this wouldn't have happened. That statement from an Israeli prime minister most likely would not have happened in the 1940s, 1950s. But what I have found is that many people listed the Holocaust as a reason why they're fighting. That they say, as American Jews, they feel it is their duty, they feel this moral obligation to help with the establishment of Israel, right? Just because Israel declared independence on May 14th doesn't necessarily mean that a Jewish state has automatically been created, that Israel is actively fighting to establish that. And so individuals are writing about this moral obligation. And like I had mentioned at the beginning, of course, if we're talking about 1,100 American volunteers, most of them are Jews, some of them are not. We also know that there are millions of other American Jews who are not going to Israel. It's not to suggest anything about their commitment to securing a Jewish state or how they feel about the Holocaust. But again, we're talking about a very small segment of the American Jewish population. So just to kind of put that in perspective, that we're talking about within American Jewry, a very small section. And then within that, those that are using, invoking the Holocaust as a reason why they're fighting. And I will also say that it's really, from the Israeli perspective, it's also quite interesting about, well, what does that mean, volunteers from abroad? Because what about the Holocaust survivors who immigrate to Palestine and later Israel. So Israel has this really interesting mechanism for determining who is temporary and who is going to remain in Israel, right? Israel doesn't know the motivations behind who is coming and are they going to stay short-term or long-term. So oftentimes Holocaust survivors are not seen as temporary. They're seen as, oh, no, they're one of ours, right? Part of Gachal, not Machal. And, but of course, right after the war, the Israeli, part of the Israeli army or military, I should say, is really keen on keeping the Americans. They want to give them tours of the country. They want to give them extra money. They see them if they have to return, right? You know, it's not really up to Israel if they return or not, but they say if they're going to return to the US, we want them to be ambassadors and we want them to go back to their homes and tell them about all the great things that they have seen in Israel. So Israel plays a really interesting role when it comes to how it handles Holocaust survivors who are fighting, and also the role of either keeping these volunteers or if they're going to return, how to make them have, not in crass terms, but the best experience possible.
Thank you, Amy. It's really fascinating research, and I think that distinction between, you know, the Machal and Gachal, right? So that Machal, they're mitnadvim, they volunteered. Gachal, they are conscripted in the DP camps, and you know, I think that's a really interesting distinction between those who volunteer and those who are conscripted and have come to stay, hopefully. So this has been really a fascinating presentation, a wonderful lecture, and really interesting Q&A and discussion. So if everyone can please join me in a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much to Professor Amy Weiss for a wonderful lecture. And we know why your students are so fortunate to have you as an excellent instructor. Really do wonderful work in the classroom. So thank you so much, Amy. I want to thank you all for being here this evening with us and invite you to join us next Thursday night for our next lecture, our Kristallnacht lecture by Professor Daniel Green on Americans and the Holocaust. This will be next Thursday evening, November 10th at 7:30 p.m. Thank you so much to everyone for being here this evening, and we look forward to seeing all of you soon. Thank you.